Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 503, and it's July 26, 1981. There's a wedding that's going to take place in Great Britain this week. By the time many of you receive this broadcast, the wedding will be over. Prince Charles and Lady Diana. The important guest list is not who's at the wedding, but who isn't going to be at the wedding, which primarily one of the persons is President Ronald Reagan of the United States, and I'll talk about the discrepancies in the medical reports of the bullet wounds that he received in a few minutes. Is he scared to travel? Is he too sick to travel? What is the reason for his staying home? He's staying close to home. Another couple that will not travel, cousins of the king, future King of England and the present royalty, the Prince, the King and Queen of Spain, declined the invitation. They almost lost their throne in February. There was an attempted coup. In March, Ronald Reagan was shot. The Nazis almost took over their throne. And again, in May, there was an attempt, and they were planning to assassinate the King and Queen of Spain. They said that they'll stay home, and I guess they, like Ronald Reagan, prefer to be in one piece and not travel. And, of course, the Pope, I don't know if he would attend a wedding like that or not. There were other important Catholic events and a large meeting of Catholic officials at Lourdes last week that I mentioned before. He's in the hospital and still sick with fever and facing another surgery, and he also is not moving. There was a car accident of Queen Juliana and her daughter traveling in Italy last week, a head-on car crash, not advertised much in the paper, a little item in the Houston Post. A friend sent to me, that's the only place I actually saw it. Former Queen Juliana of the Netherlands and other members of her family escaped uninjured from a two-car collision at an intersection in Rome, interestingly, not in Rome, rather in Italy. She was with another daughter and members of the royal family. Queen Juliana is married to Prince Bernhard, the notorious, he was a Nazi, a member of Hitler's Nazi group in Germany, and worked for IG Farben, and then he married Queen Juliana of the Netherlands. That's Prince Bernhard, who formed the Bilderberger organization and who was caught with bribes and connections to Lockheed and other payoffs, a very suspicious man in terms of controlling world power, and directly linked to Licio Gelli, the Nazi that fled down to Argentina at the time of the Masonic scandal in Italy that broke open right after the Pope was shot in Italy. So it was in Italy where Queen Juliana, the wife of Bernhard, almost was killed. She survived. I don't know if she'll attend the wedding or not. And of course, since the first of the year, we've talked about the president of Ecuador being killed and the president of Bangladesh being killed. I understand that Newsweek Tuesday is going to come out with a story on the plans of the CIA to kill Gaddafi. Interestingly enough, the Associated Press carried a story this week. Paper reports a protest over the CIA plan. Members of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, for one of the first times, made public a protest to Ronald Reagan of the CIA plan for a covert operation in Africa. The Washington Post said the nature and more precise location of the operation was not disclosed. This was last week in the newspaper. But that this is one of the few times that the House Intelligence Committee, House Select Committee on Intelligence, has made public their findings that are usually kept secret. The Washington Post said under laws governing the CIA at the present time, the president himself must be determine that covert operations are necessary to protect our national security, and then the CIA has to tell the Intelligence Committee of the House and Senate. And it seems that when they told them they were to kill Gaddafi over in Libya, the assassination plans were stopped. I wrote after the note when I read, this was July 25th, just yesterday, I cut this out of the Washington Post. I made a note, would it be Gaddafi or Idi Amin first? And of course, in December, just before Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, I mentioned on broadcast on the station that the assassination team, the covert action, the people that killed Allende, the killer team were coming back into office full swing, and that we'd have a whole series of political assassinations. But luckily, the powers that be in the Senate and House want Mr. Casey out, and they don't want to kill Gaddafi, and I think America's name has been smeared enough with a long succession of political assassinations, a litany of them, of heads of states, and this certainly would not be in the national interest. I believe that Senator Henry Jackson was preparing the way for the Gaddafi murder. He was on Meet the Press today, that's July 26th, and he was talking about the biggest problem in the world is terrorism funded by Gaddafi to the Soviet Union. I've talked for many, many weeks and for about a year and a half or 2 years on this program about the CIA people that have armed and trained assassination teams with and for Gaddafi, Frank Turple, George Corcola, Edwin Wilson, Theodore Shackley. They armed Carlos the Jackal for international terrorism around the world. As a matter of fact, the CIA can't afford to kill Gaddafi because they'd have nobody to blame for the terrorism. They have to keep him alive to keep blaming somebody. If he's dead, then who will they blame? And they'll have to look at themselves. But Newsweek will have an article this week on the plans to kill Gaddafi. I'm always interested in what happens to musicians and the killing of musicians ever since Elvis Presley came along and the Beatles and captured the imagination of the youth in this country. And last week I talked about the collision of Harry Chapin. There was an article in the paper this week about a lawsuit involving Dr. George Nikolopoulos. I don't know if I pronounced that name right. Nikolopoulos. He was indicted for overprescribing drugs that killed Elvis Presley, and he's now under a 14-count indictment with 9 other patients, and the trial is supposed to begin in September 1981. That's about 4 weeks and 2 days from now. And one of the people in the trial against this doctor is Jerry Lee Lewis, the musician who's been on a critical list for the last 2 weeks. When I came into KLRB 2 weeks ago, we didn't know whether or not he was going to pass away. The July 12th broadcast, he's still alive, but he was in critical condition. But we didn't know at the time that in 6 weeks from now, he was part of a 14-count indictment against the same doctor that has been charged with killing Elvis Presley. Lewis had been rushed to a hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, and had abdominal pain and was spitting up blood. And the doctors are absolutely baffled. They don't know what caused the perforation, according to a news account this week. They haven't determined the cause of the tear in his stomach, and when they were asked, could it have been the drugs that were prescribed for him, the doctor said, in lieu of the trial coming up, I wouldn't touch the question of whether this stomach bleeding was caused by the drugs with a 10-foot pole. Lewis was hospitalized in 1977, the same year that Elvis Presley died, for allegedly a peptic ulcer. He also had been a friend of Presley's, and they worked together. This doctor had prescribed large amounts of Prelude and Quaaludes, but we don't know what else was in them. Anyway, the hearing takes place at a criminal court September 21st, 1981, and I don't know whether Jerry Lee Lewis will be alive enough to be among the other 9 other people, patients, charging this doctor with the problems. But an article in the paper this week suggested that the same doctor who was responsible for doing in Elvis Presley, the real king of the rock music that started the movement, really going and inspired so many people, whether this doctor also was responsible for Lewis. According to this article, Lewis collapsed when he was preparing for a concert tour to promote his new top-of-the-chart record. Interestingly enough, almost every rock star musician that died just on the eve of a new concert coming out, whether it was Mama Cass or Otis Redding or Jim Croce or Janis Joplin with the Pearl album. They were all on the crest of a big break when something happened to them and they died. There's a new magazine on the stands. You might have seen it in the supermarkets. It's called The Investigator. The publisher is Jack Anderson, and the chief investigator is the gentleman from Texas, J.J. Arms. It's an interesting magazine. There's marvelous articles in there, one after the other. It's put out by a man named William McGraw. I talked to him this week. I called him in El Paso, Texas, and talked to him. And he has a statement as the editor of this new magazine that he feels it is the absolute obligation of people to uncover scandals. And he said the purpose of this is to give you an idea of some of the scandals that fall on the cutting room floor of newspapers. And he made a point in the editorial of saying the uncovering of a scandal begins with a perception that ripples slowly across society. Now, on KLRB, I have talked for 10 years and on other stations about these various scandals that take place. They begin small and they grow big, not only on this station, but on other radio stations. And this man who is taking this magazine out, the editor, William McGraw, feels that even though they start small, that they do come across society. These scandals can be uncovered. And he feels that the press, by and large, ignores stories. He says they fail to grasp early the importance of some stories, and reporters don't jump on it to widen the beachhead. They don't confront it. They don't reach the levels where the public advocates can take it up, and the investigative agencies then can grind, and mass opinion can get redress. That when we see a sign of a story or a scandal, too often it falls, and he blames a lot of it on the newspaper cutting room. And the purpose of this new magazine, he said, is to disinter political skeletons that were once laid to rest and dig up scandals that the government tried to cover up to expose corporate conniving, labor abuses, and other skullduggeries that might serve the public interest. It's an interesting magazine, and I recommend that you look for it on the newsstands or subscribe to it. He goes on to say that preposterous lies are told to make the powerful look good. Grievous blunders are committed by officials in the name of the government. The public is cheated by men who are sworn to uphold public trust. But if one investigative reporter makes a little bit of a mistake, there's an outrage. And he goes on to say that he wants the facts, and he'll verify facts and print them. Now, this first issue as a section by William Proxmire. There's a confidential file by Jack Anderson. There's an article by McGraw himself on the oil that is in America that we could use as much oil as in Saudi Arabia. There's another interesting article in here on the revival of the French Connection, by Hank Messick. I've mentioned on this program that one of the reasons I thought for shooting Pope John Paul II and his links to Pope Paul VI and Richard Nixon and later to Ronald Reagan and the American CIA was that the Republican government had cut off the growing of opium in Turkey that went down to Marseille and the French Connection in order to give the narcotic trade to the Shah of Iran and the Southeast Asia gang, that it was a dope war, and that this group had tied off the source of income of the Turkish people who were growing the opium and bringing it from Colombia and other places instead. And that as soon as the Pope was shot and as soon as there was a rearrangement of the narcotic traffic after the Shah was out, then the French Connection was revived, and Hank Messick, an authority on that, has an article in this magazine. And there is another story here, The Unsolved Mystery, The Deadly Double. And this article is about the intelligence agencies missing a tip-off on the Pearl Harbor attack. And maybe next week I'll do it length if I have time, and if you don't get the magazine or go over it with you. The information in the New Yorker magazine 6 weeks prior to Pearl Harbor, and then finally the November 22nd issue before Pearl Harbor. The attack took place December the 7th. And this author, Diana Huntress, analyzes what was in the New Yorker magazine that gave the clues that Pearl Harbor was going to be bombed by the Japanese. And also it goes into an agent of the OSS who placed the ads in the papers. It's a mystery who done it, who did the placing the ad and the information about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now that interested me because in April of this year I had on this program stories from Newsweek and the Washington Post, and the Washington Post owns the Newsweek, on indications that Ronald Reagan was going to be shot at the time that he was. And I also got fine material from researcher in the Southwest from Texas on the New York Times articles that indicated that Ronald Reagan would be shot the night of the Academy Award. No, that was March the 30th, and these were placed March the 15th in the New York Times, a full page of messages that would indicate that the event would take place. Now, I've seen this phenomena quite a few times, and I've mentioned it on this broadcast. The case of the book, The Black Abductor, in San Diego, that came out prior to the Patty Hearst kidnapping. There was no such author, there was no such book publisher. It was a story of the heiress of a newspaper chain in California who is living with her teacher from a private school, and she's going to University of Berkeley, and she's kidnapped by a black radical. The whole script before the kidnapping was in the book, The Black Abductor. So I've noticed this for a long time, the phenomena, but it was interesting to see in this first issue of The Investigator the indications going back to Pearl Harbor, and now becoming aware that the news media does, in fact, give you clues to events prior to their happening. I've watched it for a long time, and this article is interesting. There is a book, another book I mentioned, The Murder on Embassy Row, last week, and for the last few weeks, the murder of Orlando Letelier and Sandra Moffit, because the people that were involved in that killing, Edwin Wilson, had close contacts to the intelligence community, the Gaddafi connections, the CIA, the detonation weapons that blew up the car. Letelier was the Chilean ambassador to the United States. Allende, the president of Chile, was murdered, the elected president, by the CIA in 1973. And in 1976, Letelier was murdered in Washington, D.C. Now, I have a lot of information on Chile, and I would like to go into the Allende murder and the Letelier murders a little bit each week, or maybe one broadcast on just those, because it involves George Bush, our vice president, Alexander Haig, our Secretary of State, Vernon Walters, the floating advisor to Ronald Reagan right now, Theodore Shackley, the man that supplied the weapons for Gaddafi, the assassination weapons, George Corcola and his links to Frank Turple, of the CIA, who set up assassination teams and do security for the Secret Service, for Exxon, for Scotland Yard. These murders, the Allende murder and the Letelier murder, involve the very people that are in power today, the same people that would kill Gaddafi, and the Senate and the House Committee stopped it. These people are in power today, and they ran brutal regimes and still do, allowing and teaching torture in Chile and Argentina, and they're doing and Paraguay and Brazil, wiping out Indian populations, Uruguay. And because they're in power today and nobody has stopped their power, it gives you a little preview of what we could expect from them if they are not stopped and people don't demand an end to the bloodbath that they will put, if they have their way, in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, and so forth. Now, the book The Death in Washington by Donald Freed, with Dr. Fred Simon Landis, goes into an area that I have done many broadcasts on, and they refer to Michael Townley. He's of the CIA, worked for Ford Motor Company. His father's vice president of a bank in Florida. He worked for NASA. Townley went down to Chile, and he worked with General Contreras. And this is from the Don Freed book, Death in Washington. The other book, The Murder on Embassy Row, several weeks ago, I talked about General Contreras. He was a Nazi. He worked with the Nazis in Chile and in Argentina and South America, and he was the man who went up to see Vernon Walters, who was deputy director of the CIA, and said, Walters will go along with us on torture and missing persons. Walters is our advisor in El Salvador and Honduras at the present time. Walters will go along with torture and missing persons, and they went to see George Bush also, who was director of the CIA when Letelier and Sandra Moffit were killed. And in this book, it reports about Michael Townley working with General Contreras. Michael Townley, keep in mind he was an American citizen who worked with Edwin Wilson, the gentleman who has the farm next to Senator John Warner of Virginia. Townley was in charge of organizing former members of various fronts in Chile into special interrogation units. Townley and a Colonel Pedro Espinosa set up the DINA, D-I-N-A. That was the secret police similar to SAVAK that the CIA set up in Greece. They were charged with going to a place called Colonia, Dignidad. Now, for those of you who do not have my past broadcasts, April in 1979, I did 3 broadcasts. They were numbered 385, 387, and 386, and 387. I refer often to Colonia Dignidad and the links and comparisons to Jonestown. But if you want to order those broadcasts or get the sheets on them with the bibliography, you can. But talking about Colonia Dignidad. Now, Michael Townley from the CIA set up Colonia Dignidad. I said Dignidad in Chile, which borders on Argentina, which is a haven described in Ladislas Farrago's book Aftermath, haven for Joseph Mengele and for Martin Bormann and all the top Nazis that were in South America floating around from the end of World War II and going back and forth to Europe or wherever they meet. They were down in Colonia, and Townley worked with these Nazis and set up a torture center. It was called the Benevolent and Educational Society of Dignity. Remember Jim Jones said, die with dignity. According to the book Death in Washington, they had thousands of acres in southern Chile. It was called a model farm, and I did comparisons earlier on the model farm of Jonestown that Mark Lane and Charles Gary were selling in the model farm of Colonia. They had women and children on this farm from West Germany. No visitors are allowed to see the acreage under cultivation. It has a hospital, a factory, an orphanage. The children only learn German and English. Michael Townley of the CIA and Espinosa of Chile organized Colonia Dignidad for political prisoners, and Amnesty International described this is what Townley of the CIA, working with Edwin Wilson and Vernon Walters and George Bush, would do. They put leather hoods placed over prisoners' heads. They were stuck to their faces with chemical adhesives. In the cell, torturers were carried. They had closed-circuit radio systems where the detainees were taken naked, tied to their berths with electric shocks applied. To one of the prisoners, a torturer made the statement that Colonia Dignidad is the work of the Nazi concentration camps continued in Chile. And, of course, in this book, page 115, 114, run by the Central Intelligence Agency. That's why it's so important when I say that Reinhard Gehlen, chief of Hitler's intelligence Eastern Division, set up the CIA when that happened between 1945 and 47 and the National Security Council. These tortures are going on today in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Chile, and Argentina, and Paraguay, and Uruguay right now. It hasn't stopped. This is 1981. Now, Townley worked at Colonia Dignidad in the DINA Center, which was a grisly laboratory for experiments conducted on prisoners, not only for getting information, but to perfect the science of torture. This is in 1976 when George Bush, our vice president, was director of the CIA. In Colonia Dignidad, they were subject to different experiments. Without any interrogation at all, dogs were trained to commit sexual aggressions and destroy sexual organs of both sex. Prisoners were tortured and personalized, finding their weaknesses. This so-called home for boys, the leader of the colony is Paul Schaefer, accused of criminal sexual abuse of children in Germany in 1960 when he moved to Chile. The group on the Argentine border of Colonia Dignidad is run by business interests, the United States, supported by the Nazis, by the West German and American embassies. Amnesty International has described Colonia Dignidad as a torture and detention center, and Michael Townley of the CIA worked at the farm and was busy, according to this book, quartering people and taking off arms and legs. Townley was known as Welch, Michael Townley Welch, in the Center for Torture. There was a radio station that went to Venezuela, Colombia, France, Sweden, and Italy, and 50% of the agents of this police force were military personnel, not civilians, that worked in the countries all around the world that came there. There was a death squad, a bloodbath that continued. One man, Andrea Silva, appeared without a head. The body of Daniel Mendez had the arms torn off. Ruben Vargas was without ears. Segundo Rodrero was without one arm. Orlando Borbizier without hands and nose. And Rosendo Robello with one leg torn away at the root. Every day, while Michael Townley of the Central Intelligence Agency, working with Vernon Walters and George Bush and the CIA, every day hideously mutilated, disfigured corpses floated down the canals and rivers and onto the beaches, and there were quartered men everywhere. Now, this is when Letelier was taken into prison, and then he was later released. He spent 364 days in 8 concentration camps, left and went to Washington, D.C., and then was blown up. Now, this book goes into David Phillips of the Central Intelligence Agency and his role in these activities. Now, this is a very strong book. It links to things that I've said about colonial dignidad, the fascism, the role of Henry Kissinger, the Nazi, the General Haig, the State Department, our bloodbath that hopefully, maybe with the House and the Senate stopping the murder of Gaddafi, they will stop these terrible indignities against people that are going on under the name of business and multinational profit. The important thing is that one of the people named in this book, David Phillips, is now suing the authors of this book, Donald Fried and Dr. Fred Landis. Death in Washington names George Bush. It names General Vernon Walters, Henry Kissinger, Michael Vernon Townley, William Buckley, both the Buckley brothers, for their hideous role in Central and South America, which they're continuing with their bloodbath. Senator James Buckley, Alexander Haig, and Dean Hinton. Now, Dean Hinton was in Chile. He was Guatemala when that country was overthrown by the CIA. He was in Chile when the tortures went on, and today he's the new ambassador to El Salvador. That's just what we need, is Mr. Dean Hinton in El Salvador. He was part of the coup that did away with Allende. David Phillips is suing Donald Fried and others. It's a $90 million lawsuit. If you want to send money to Donald Fried, they need $5,000 to defend themselves. This is a showpiece suit. They need $5,000 right away. The address is 3760 Cardiff Avenue, Cardiff Avenue, Los Angeles 90034. If I went too fast, you can write or call me or send a postcard. Send $25 if you have it, or $10 or $5. Ramsey Clark is going to help with the defense. He's volunteered his time. Ramsey Clark was once the Attorney General. They're asking for help. They need $5,000. If ever there was a strong book and a good person, I don't agree always with some of the things Don Fried does, but he was the one who brought Louis Tackwood out, who wrote the Glass House tapes, who talked about the plans to kill Richard Nixon in the White House at the time of the nomination, and he talked about the secret team that I referred to over and over again on these broadcasts, the same secret team of fascism, such as the Masonic group in Italy that has been temporarily broken up. Don Fried has written about the Rosenbergs, about the Black Panther trials. He has a lot of good books out, and they certainly deserve a break. I don't even see how David Atlee Phillips at this time has the nerve to sue Donald Fried, and I offered him all of my investigative noxy, anything I have, to put together the what he's saying in this book about the Colonia Dignidad, the CIA, and the role of these people, because this isn't past history. What I'm talking about with you isn't academic. Sometimes we go back 17 years to who killed John Kennedy, or the Martin Luther King murder, or Robert Kennedy murder. Sometimes we say about the history of World War II and the Nazis. But these are people who came to power through the murders of many people, maybe 200, 300, 400 people that they well, thousands, really. I mean, the director of the CIA, William Colby, admitted killing 20 or 40 to 60,000 with the Phoenix program in Southeast Asia. I'm just talking about heads of states or lawyers or writers or witnesses to trials and witnesses to Senate hearings in order to keep their power. These people are stone killers, and they will quarter. I don't want to scare you and say the boogeyman is coming, but they can't get away with these things they shouldn't. And if there's anything that you can do to help contribute to Don Fried's trial, and I'm sure he will win it, you will be proud that you took some part in it, because we all broke, but we all have to do something for him. It's terribly important. I came back on KLRB after a break of a short period of time. It seemed short to me. July 27th, that was just a year ago tonight, and I've referred to that broadcast where I talked about the most important news stories of the past 2 years that had preceded July 27th. It was exactly a year ago tomorrow. And again, Among those stories was the Jonestown murders, experimentations, and the links to Chile and Argentina. That was broadcast number 451, and under that, Colonia, Dignidad, Operation Condor, those are the assassination teams, Chile, Argentina assassination teams, going back to the JFK assassination. Now, this whole era of Bush, Walters, Kissinger, Townley, Buckley, Haig, the whole gang, should really be swept out just as the top people in Italy were swept out. I say this over and over, but they shouldn't be allowed in government, and I hope they don't fall easy like Casey or John Mitchell, some of these people. I hope that the people involved in these crimes will suddenly come forward and expose them, hopefully, or more investigators will get on their cases and show the torturous links that they've had to hundreds and thousands of deaths in the past years. Now, we'll take a 1-minute break. Time for you to turn that cassette over if you're taping these broadcasts, and then we'll go on to another subject in 1 minute.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International.
Last week on this program, I mentioned a newspaper article in the Los Angeles Times, June 24th, 1981, about David Murdoch, a very secretive man, only one article written about him in 1979, allegedly has $500 million. He has $200 million in stock that's on the stock exchange, and the rest is his own separate money with no special accounting. And I talked about the questionable background of some of his investments that are terribly important. His roots were allegedly from Detroit, Michigan, into Phoenix, Arizona, and then Los Angeles. Long, strong contacts with Barry Goldwater, with John Connally, former Secretary of the Navy, former governor of Texas at the time Kennedy was killed, and a very important man in U.S. history. He hired Robert Haldeman, Murdoch did, after Watergate, after he got out of jail, and he's the angel behind what he hopes is the future Republican governor of California, Lieutenant Mike Kerb, and he also funded the campaign of Chief of Police Ed Davis, now a California senator, and Ed Davis is the man mentioned by Louis Tackwood, and the Glass House tapes with his criminal conspiracy section and his Operation Chaos and the assassination plans that they had and the dirty tricks that the Los Angeles Police Department did with the FBI and CIA while Tackwood worked for them. Now, this week, there is another important article similar to the Murdoch article, only instead of the Los Angeles Times, it's in the Washington Post. And this is about a man named Richard Mellon Scaife, S-C-A-I-F-E. And if I'm going fast with these names, the people listening to this broadcast can write to me and send a self-addressed stamped envelope. And I'll enclose the bibliography of the sources of information so you can look them up at the library and copy them if you want. Mr. Scaife is described in the Washington Post as the mystery angel of the new right. In the LA Times, we had a little peek at David Murdoch, and now we have Richard Mellon Scaife. This story headlines how Richard Mellon Scaife shelled out $100 million to bring many voices of his conservative chorus. Well, he's related to the Mellon family, richest family in the United States. There are some good books on the Mellons, and I'll give you the list of those maybe next week. The article tells about a man who worked at KNXT radio in Los Angeles, the CBS affiliate, and John Cox Jr., an aide to Barry Goldwater, and they met with an aide of Mr. Scaife's, and he gave them $100,000 to start a foundation for American communications. Mr. Scaife is not only one of the richest men in America, but he is the most important man in forming public opinion. Now, it's very hard to believe that when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, that they had people with $500 million and $100 million in private trusts that nobody can get to check out who these people are, or that they can control the communications market to tell us who our enemy is, who our friends are, who we should fight, when we should go to war. This is what Mr. Richard Mellon Scaife's hobby is having conferences, think tanks, bringing in professors, bringing in federal judges, giving them weekends, days, courses, And he seems to be the hidden man behind much of the far right. And somebody seems to be catching on, or somebody seems to be angry enough to be printing these articles now about Murdoch and Scaife and realizing that the Constitution and the rights of the American people somehow is usurped by these moguls who have moved in to take over all means of communication. I got an article from the Houston Post this week that the Mellons just hired the head of NBC and the director of Associated Press to be on the board of directors of Gulf Oil. Gulf Oil is the Mellon family. But this one character has taken his interest to take over the news media. Another member of the family that we can go into, the Hitchcock member, was behind Timothy Leary and the CIA and dispensing LSD to those people who would be of the left or be of the kind of mentality that would drop out of society during the Vietnam War period. They took care of drugging and doping those. That was another member of the Mellon family. This one has a consuming desire to control the news media and collect facts and data for seminars and groups on what he thinks should be before the American people to influence their public opinion. He's involved with publications in Pittsburgh. He has newspapers, and also James Watt, the controversial fellow with our environment. You like Mr. James Watt? Well, Scaife is the largest single donor to what is known as the Mountain States Legal Foundation. James Watt was president of Mountain States Foundation at the time that Scaife was putting money into James Watt. When you want to protest your shores and you want to protect your shores from drilling or cutting the trees down or whatever it is, you're not fighting James Watt. You're fighting the Mellon family, who made up their minds that that land is useful for something other than sitting under a tree or being out in the ocean unpolluted. He was President Watt of this Mountain States Legal Foundation, and for a while people thought Joseph Coeur was a large contributor to the Heritage Foundation, the think tank. Joseph Coeur from Denver, Colorado. Now it turns out that it's the Scaife family, the Mellons, and that this Mountain States group, the legal foundation, that was described as being interested in timber, utilities, and mining interests. The largest single donor to the whole group is the same man who funds the Heritage Foundation. Now, that Heritage is a think tank whose director was part of the Mooney organization. He left the Mooneys to come to the Heritage. Mooney had money that also, I was told, and I've mentioned before on broadcast, had come from Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. The Heritage Foundation has 11 members of it that were a part of Ronald Reagan's transition team, and Scaife until now is described as the mystery angel, and he put money into the Heritage Foundation. And when you see quotations of opinions on the Soviet Union and war and peace and what we need in the terms of weapons, these people are absolute fanatics into the subject that war is necessary and that the Soviet Union has to be wiped out. Our allies aren't agreeing with us, and they're getting scared, and that's the important thing, is that creeps like this, who are the richest family in America, can own all these foundations and give propaganda page after page, institute after institute. But when it comes to the push and shove, the Dutch, the French, the Germans, the people in European countries are scared of Ronald Reagan and Alexander Haig and the Heritage Foundation and Georgetown University Center for Strategic Studies. He's the major beneficiary of those. He's a long, close associate, he was, of J. Edgar Hoover, who was vice president of Interpol. That was Hitler's secret police organization that continued after the war, not finding drug connections, but I don't really even know who Interpol ever finds, except that they have data banks on most of us around the country. He's a long admirer of Barry Goldwater, so he and David Murdoch, I'm sure, come from the same fabric, where one is taking care of politicians like Mike Kerb and a future appointment of John Connolly, of Alexander Haig's pushed out, and Ed Davis, and so forth, while one is taking care of politics in this state. This fellow, Richard Mellon Scaife, is interested in the news media. He's the second largest stockholder in the Mellon Bank. He has a home in Pebble Beach, California, and in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and a lot of other places. And as I say, the money came from Gulf oil stock, a big investment, the first Boston corporation and holdings newspapers in Pennsylvania and around the country. He also took over from John McGuff the controversial newspaper in Sacramento, the Sacramento Union. McGuff was linked to propaganda from South Africa that was being sent over here by Mr. Volster and Botha to blow up how wonderful South Africa is, how much fairness to the blacks, how great the economy. Money from South Africa as a propaganda machine was put into John McGuff in 1977, the Sacramento Union, and then Richard Mellon Scaife took that over. He's the owner of the Kern House Enterprises, a London-based news agency. He was the owner. It folded up at the time of Richard Helms' questioning in 1968 before some investigations. It was reported that this was a CIA front and a communist anti-communist propaganda agency in London. He worked with the CIA, of course, and gave $1 million, controversial to Richard Nixon's campaign in 1972. When Nixon was on the way out after June of 72 with Watergate, in 73 is when he pushed the funds for the New Right. In 1973 was the year that Ronald Reagan wanted to start the Institute to study the causes of violent behavior at UCLA with the CIA and Nazis from Germany and Dr. Delgado from Boston and Spain to do electrode implants on people. And 1973 was the year that Jonestown was leased by a bank in Canada, people from Germany and England. He started the New Right in 73 and began pushing the magazines and articles and various foundations, and he now gives an admitted $10 million a year. It's very hard for the left or the Women's International League for Peace or Peace and Freedom or the individuals to fight organizations like this that are so powerful, and it's good that the Washington Post is now having an article about him. They have a section where the money goes, where Mr. Scaife has been giving his money since 1973. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, they send that Nazi Kissinger all over the world, tout him from the center, and also our ambassador to the UN, Ms. Kirkpatrick. Scaife gave them $5.3 million recently. Georgetown University in Washington, the Committee for a Free World in New York, the Committee for Present Danger, Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace. He gave them $3.5 million. That makes up a bulk of the cabinet of Ronald Reagan and the warfare state. The Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis at Cambridge, the National Security Program from New York University, $6 million for the National Strategy Information Centers. He has economic symposiums and councils, one in Westwood Foundation for Research in Economics and Education, $1.4 million. International Center for Economic Policy Studies. It goes on and on. Every one of these organizations and group and legal group in Atlanta, Georgia, Sacramento, Philadelphia, Kansas City, Chicago, Denver, Colorado. That's the Mountain States Legal Foundation. See, when they mention legal groups, it says Mountain States Legal Foundation, Denver, Colorado. But that's just one of 8 legal groups. And then Mr. Watts, the Secretary of the Interior, wants to destroy the ecology of the entire United States. So when you add up where these millions are going, $10 million a year, they're going into places like the National Strategy Information Center. Every year they invite young people there for seminars and influence their thinking about the future. The Law and Economics Center in Atlanta, Georgia. I read about that a long time ago, but the article didn't say that Richard Mellon Scaife was behind that, where they invite 137 federal judges for economic courses on the evils of socialism and labor in favor of being hard on communists, I suppose. The Institute for Contemporary Studies, the presidential counselor, the founder of that was Edwin Meese, and he was put in by Scaife. Scaife has newspapers he supports, and he had a seminar for Henry Kissinger from the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. The list goes on and on in the Washington Post about this man. Controls are the largest donor to WGBH in Boston, radio broadcasting, WQLN in Erie, Pennsylvania, he sponsored a 10-part series on Milton Friedman's economy. I see these things on television, these series, and these men miss the boat. The country's bankrupt. The industrialized nations are sinking. And these are the think tanks funded by the richest family in America, fanatics who don't want coexistence but would rather go to war than reduce their profits in any way with the working people and bring peace and safe, clean air to the world. They are totally, and I believe, mentally sick, and something has to be done about them. And I guess one of the first things is to smoke them out. So it's commendable that there was this article in the Washington Post. This is July the 12th, 1981. Now, an important magazine that he got out was the Daedalus, D-A-E-D-A-L-U-S. And in this magazine in 1978, and this is very important, he hired a Harvard historian, Richard Pipes. That's the same Mr. Pipes that told the Soviet Union that they'd have to give up communism or be wiped out. That was one of the first speeches of the Reagan team. As a matter of fact, March 29th on this broadcast, I referred to Richard Pipes, one of the 5 people in the State Department fighting among each other against Ronald Reagan. I mentioned Alexander Haig, Walter Stessel, Richard Pipes, Richard Allen, and William Casey, who's sliding out on his ass. Not soon enough. And under Pipes, March 29th, I said Richard Pipes, the Harvard Soviet expert with Harvard's Priscilla Johnson. That was a woman that worked for the CIA with Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald in the Soviet Union. It was Pipes who told the Soviet Union, as soon as Ronald Reagan was in office, they have to give up communism or go to war. Well, whose blood fights the war? Whose money pays the taxes? Whose homes are ruined? Who takes care of the refugees? What right has Richard Mellon, Scaife, to be the mouthpiece for people like Pipes that are telling these people that we have to go to war? And I mentioned in March of this year that Richard Pipes worked with George Bush. He's our vice president now. He was director of the CIA at the time that John Paisley from the Team A of the CIA was confronting Team B. Paisley was murdered, and Pipes headed Team B. Well, the Washington Post has an article that Pipes was encouraged and got money from the Scaife charity up to $50,000. They proposed to be a backer for Pipes, and the idea was this, that the CIA is too favorable to the Soviet Union, that their figures aren't right. So we'll get an outside person to put up a fund, and Mr. Bush, the director of the CIA, had Team B, and this article in the Washington Post very cleverly leaves out Team A, because the man opposing Pipes, and Pipes was funded by Richard Mellon Scaife, was the John Paisley who was murdered. Now, Paisley had a direct telephone communication on his yacht down to Australia at the New Guinean bank that was funding Michael Townley and the torture machine down in Argentina. So these aren't nice guys we're talking about. But Mr. Mellon Scaife puts up money for a study. Mr. Paisley, who has the opposing view, is found dead. And then Pipes goes on to become, as Washington described, our Harvard Soviet expert. He's Mr. Mellon, Richard Mellon Scaife's expert. He's not our expert, and our allies are finally catching on. The purpose of the study was, in quotes, to make assessment of Soviet military strength. And out of Team B, the Washington Post, came a lot of articles that poured out. Russia is stronger than us. Our army won't hold up. We don't have any tanks. We don't have good missiles. We don't have any warning system. Our estimates are wrong. The Russians are bent on nuclear superiority. Out of this twisted, demented mind come contracts for United Technology that Alexander Haig is president of, was getting $1 million a year. Rockwell, that our Attorney General William French Smith is a lawyer for Rockwell. The Hughes Organization, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, the warfare machinery. We make hardware, go into debt, put machinery together that people can't even figure out how to use. They couldn't use it on the desert with the sand traps in Iran. And mentally deranged people who have so much money buy up newspapers, buy up think tanks, buy the scholars, and then tell us they are the living authority on the subject, and buy up James Watt and tell us what we need to keep the economy going in terms of coal or oil off the shelves. And it'd be interesting to know if Mr. Watt's oil that he would drill, say, off the coast of California would be Gulf oil into Richard Mellon Scaife's pocket. These things simply cannot continue, and I hope that, as I say, somebody in the Washington Post has this article, I hope they're getting on these subjects. Now, I've done many broadcasts on Colonia, Dignidad, and the CIA, and Jonestown, and the links to the intelligence community and the torture centers there. I also did broadcasts in 1979, January 19th and 26th, and those tapes are number 372 and 373 on John Paisley. Now, John Paisley was murdered. His boat was found September 24th. His body was found October the 1st. It was sent to a CIA mortuary. The hands were cut off. He was cremated. There were discrepancies in the account, and I said that Paisley worked for the CIA and the Defense Department since 1948 and worked with the Soviet Affairs and Lee Harvey Oswald, and went at length on John Paisley and the teams A and B that he was working with, and discussed that a long time ago. And the links also I mentioned of John Paisley and these various people, Thomas Karamazine, who was killed right after John Paisley died, around the same time period. I have to look up the date. And George DeMohrenschildt, another person, they all died within a very short time of each other. And Lee Harvey Oswald worked with these people and the CIA, and I mentioned that their contacts were with Alexander Ziger at the Minsk radio factory. That's where Marina Oswald met Lee Harvey Oswald, and Ziger was from Argentine, and referred to the Argentine connections that goes back to the Nazi connections down in Chile and Argentine. Well, when I wrote about and read rather on the air about teams A and B, and Paisley being done in because he was Team A, and Mr. Pipes moving up to be one of the officials of Soviet affairs because he was Team B. I didn't know then that Richard Mellon Scaife was the man behind Pipes and those figures, but it all does come together. Sometimes I speak to young people who do research or listen to the broadcast or get discouraged because things don't move fast enough for them to get a lot of the information out to other people. They can't see it fast enough. They can't see action coming together. There are people bringing these pieces of the puzzle together for you. It's my job to interpret it. There aren't many people around that have the nerve to do it or the skill to do it, but it should be encouraging to you to know that many people are getting articles out, or like that magazine Investigator, or books like The Death on Embassy Row or the Don Freed book on the murders, the murder in Washington. These people have taken a lot of courage. The death in Washington, the murder of Letelier, they have courage. They've taken stands. The pieces that they know fit in with the pieces that somebody else knows. And hopefully the members of the House and Senate turn down the CIA's plans to kill Gaddafi. Hopefully. There are some people with some decency left who are tired of America pushing and shoving and killing and are not going to take the voices of Richard Mellon Scaife or the Heritage Foundation or any of their think tanks and put their lives on the line for it. There's a long article in the New York Times, July the 12th, by Leslie Gelb, well-known writer, titled, NATO is Facing Paralysis of Will. The experts contend there's disputes and paralysis with NATO. Why? Because they don't go along with Richard Mellon Scaife and Richard Pipes and Alexander Haig. This article in the New York Times says that there always was worry about Washington, whether they would use nuclear weapons to defend Europe, blow Europe up at the same time, or whether they would not use their weapons for fear of jeopardizing the American territory and throw them to the Russians. By all accounts, these worries are acute, and they started gathering again with the NATO in December of '79. Our Atlantic allies are worried. German officials said we faced 3 crises after the war. We said, whose side are we on, Russian or American? And we chose America. In the late 60s, the question was, what should we do with our relations with the East and with Entente? And the New York Times goes on to say the debate in West Germany is whether they made a mistake to ally themselves with us, that other countries, the diplomats in other countries such as the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, are showing decreasing sympathy to almost any American world position and increasingly pick up the Russian position and have been unreliable in upholding their share of their alliance with military burden to us because they're more sympathetic. They feel that the elite in big countries are opposed to mass movements, and they don't want to make things better. They want to push and shove. And this is from the New York Times. The Washington Post has an article, July the 15th, 1981, by Irving Kristol, professor at NYU Graduate School. NATO at a dead end. And remember, Alexander Haig was the head of NATO and now is Secretary of State. You'd think that his great record would follow him. And they say this administration of Ronald Reagan is faced with three crises: their foreign policy and their relationship with Russia, the administration's NATO alliances, and their policies towards the third world. The United States is performing poorly, and it's time to go on, not with inherited assumptions and inherited policies, but to have new policies. And Western Europe has a wave of public opinion that favors unilateral nuclear disarmament, and it's gathering forces, and they don't want to be aligned with us. If it's a question of arming and getting ready to fight Russia, or disarm and take a chance that Russia will take over, our allies are beginning to go that way. And finally, the Covert Action newspaper put out by AG from Europe. It's published in New York, an article by Fred Landis, April 1981, The Spies and the Reagan Victory. And this is about the book The Spike, the propaganda machine of the Heritage Foundation, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And it's an article, I'll do more next week because we only have about 3 minutes, but it's called The Right's Revenge, and it refers to Robert Moss and Arnaud de Bourchgrave, who wrote the book The Spike. And it goes into Chile and disinformation of the CIA from 1970 to 1973, the crisis in Europe, and the role of David Atlee Phillips, Richard Helms, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, and the late Thomas Karamazov. He's the fellow that worked in Russian affairs with Paisley and died when Paisley did. At the time, the House Select Committee was going into the John Kennedy assassination because that was their link to the murder of John Kennedy through Navy intelligence and the National Security Council. This article in Covert Action goes at length about the Church Committee, Senator Frank Church's committee, and the spies from the past that are into the Reagan administration. Now, the interesting thing is the link of people like Richard Mellon, Scaife, being the funding source behind these books and so forth, and it goes into Alpha 66, the anti-Castro Cubans, and of course that goes again into Frank Churchill and Edwin Wilson and Theodore Shackley and the highest levels of the United States intelligence, the murders in Chile, not only of Allende, but other people that I can read a whole list of them from the books of the murders that they've done in public officials. Now, these articles that have come out recently on these dogs, and they are dogs, are interesting. The one on Murdoch, the one on Scaife. Maybe next week we'll have another expose. I think that, as I say, the publications or the authors of these articles must be getting the go-ahead. Smoke these people out. Scaife was literally unknown as the man behind Watts, the Secretary of Interior, the Heritage Foundation, for most of us, or behind pipes and so forth. And Murdoch, the man behind the future career of Ed Davis or Mike Kerb and so forth. Let's hope that more articles come out smoking them out, because that is the main thing that is going to help us keep some sanity, is to get these people out. Now, I didn't mention the decline of Mr. Casey, his links to Robert Vesco, the ITT affair. This is a totally unqualified man to be the head of the CIA, but he was put in because of past crimes that he knew and to keep the lid on them. He worked OSS, he worked with Hitler's Reinhard Gehlen, with Allen Dulles, formed the CIA. He's one of the earliest dogs, and he was made director of the CIA by Ronald Reagan. And it does me the utmost pleasure to hope that by next week he will be out on his butt and William Casey will not be head of the CIA any longer. They may pull another one, but they'll never get one as bad as him, or I doubt if they'll get one as corrupt. In the meantime, keep reading your papers because there are some good articles and reviews and books, and I'll be back with you next week at this time, and you take care. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.